Hi there everyone. In my last video, you might remember, I spent some time talking about the book Chav Solidarity, which I think is a really important book to read at the moment, especially if you're trying to engage in some sort of left-wing activism, for the way that it explores how certain class dynamics play out within our society, and how the left sometimes fails to take account for them. Since making that video, I was lucky enough to be able to get an interview with D. Hunter himself, the author of Chav Solidarity, so we could explore some of the ideas from the book in more depth. I think the discussion went to some very interesting places. I hope you do too. And if you're interested in finding more out about D. Hunter's ideas, you can check out the link to his website in the description, and a link to where you can buy his book. Oh, and by the way, there were some sound issues when we were recording, so sorry for the fairly mixed quality of this sound recording here. And now, over to the interview. So, hi D.
Hey.
Really nice to meet you.
You too, mate.
So, to start off with, do you want to tell us a little bit about Chav Solidarity, why you wrote it, and some of the things that are in it?
Sure, yeah.
Things like that?
Yep. So, I wrote the bulk of the content for Chav Solidarity, going on 3 years now, isn't it? Mostly as there were social media posts, like while I was doing night shifts in a care home. And they were a mix, and still are a mix, of analysis of the radical left, which I'd been part of for, at that time, 13 or so years, and also reflections on the experiences I had growing up, which were primarily set in a context of poverty and social exclusion. So I spent a good decade street homeless. I had just prolonged crack and crystal meth addictions with a mix of other substances. I was a child sex worker. I was a petty thief and drug dealer, and was in and out of various institutions. And then I came out of that over a few years in different ways, and found myself in the radical left, involved in various different social movements, from No Borders stuff, anti-prison organising, first for a period of time, Radical Roots, but also lots of local community organising projects. And the book was just my reflections on that, and the ways in which the radical left and the more moderate left, or whatever you want to call it, engage with, talk about, frame the people who are the most economically and socially marginalised in the country, which isn't, and it wasn't a positive reflection on how they do that. I still have a fairly solid critique of the smugness, the patronising-ness, the arrogance of the radical left, even though I am very much still part of it. The book, those social media posts, people responded relatively positively, or at least were interested in them. I got very sick for a period of time with mental health issues, and shortly, once I came out of that, I kind of started to try and rewrite those social media posts into something slightly more coherent and less ranty, though they still have a ranty tendency. And over about a period of 6-7 months, a bunch of friends helped us overcome my dyslexia when writing, and it did a lot of editing for me. And then I printed off 100 copies, half expecting 50 to go to friends and 50 to go into my cellar and just sit there getting musty and my partner pissed off. But they sold, and this was all last winter, and since January this year I've been going around talking about the book, trying to flog as many copies as I can, and I've sold far more than expected.
And it's amazing. I mean, I, coming from a middle class background, as I quite obviously do by my voice, I was, it was a book that I found incredibly powerful, I read it actually. I read it in a day on a bus to London a few months ago, and once I started reading it, I just couldn't stop. I feel, and I think that one of the things that was incredibly powerful to me was how you dissected certain situations that I'd come across in my life, and really drew out in a way that I think, and really drew out some of the context from another side, which, you know, from a middle class perspective, it can be really easy to be blinded to at some points. I remember I was particularly affected by your account of something that happened at school, which, you know, I remember seeing events like that and probably being far more judgmental than I should have been at the time. So, what sort of, were you hoping to have that impact? What sort of messages did you hope that people might take from your experiences? And also, do you want to talk maybe a bit about what some of those experiences were, if you're happy to do that?
Sure, yeah. I guess a few things just from what you're saying there. I guess just on being able to tell by your voice, I'm not sure I come across I sound exactly like where I'm from either. I think those things can be there's things we can cover. I don't really know what I was expecting people. Yeah, I guess. So most of us, and myself included, go about our day to day, and it's very easy to experience situations and come up with black and white versions of events. We have implicit bias in the way we wander around life, and I guess I wanted to engage with other organisers and other activists of the left, to ask them to confront a little bit some of their implicit bias, because quite possibly because of their socioeconomic background, and the ways in which they interpreted things around them in their communities. So, a lot of the radical left, especially who are based in urban areas, tend to live in both multicultural but deprived communities, because that's where it's cheaper to live. That's where it's easy to squat a building. And in doing so, if you're not from those communities, you can interpret the events in very black and white ways, very judgmental ways. I was based in Forest Fields in Nottingham quite a long period of time, and I saw that on a day-to-day basis with comrades and people who profess to be comrades, and then I'd go to other cities and it'd be the same fucking story. So I guess I just wanted to show some examples and show it from the position of economic marginality, which might then maybe loosen some of that black and white thinking from people's heads and shake those biases a little bit. How successful will be on a case-by-case basis. Some people's biases are a little more deeply rooted than others.
Absolutely. How do you feel that some of the biases manifest that the left show towards working class people from deprived backgrounds, and so on and so forth?
Sure. So I guess from in the settings we've just been describing, I guess a big one for me is mental health. Thankfully, and it's a positive thing, people within radical circles have improved a great deal over time in the ways in which they engage with mental health and discuss it in not just individual state model basis, but different ways of collectively dealing with mental health strains. They have an analysis of where these strains come from, primarily capitalism, but many of the tentacles of capitalism as well. However, a lot of it ends up being situated around anxiety and depression, and very specific manifestations of those things. So, sitting around moping, being melancholy, which I do as much as the next person, but it is from my experience a fairly classed manifestation. So when living back where I used to live, you'd see manifestations of mental health that came through different behaviours, whether it be aggression, whether it be substance abuse, but it would also be far more likely to be in a public arena because of the limited private spaces poor and working class people have. So it become a spectacle, and I suppose like middle class activists, I'm not too keen, I like that phrase, but let's go with it anyway, are far more were more likely to judge those things and see them as individual failings and personality flaws rather than things that may well be manifestations of different mental health issues. Like you can't sit around moping, being melancholy, listening to whatever esoteric music someone might listen to, and if you have no personal space, you take it out into the street, and it then has to butt heads with many other things, so it will manifest itself differently. That same judgment and that same implicit bias, though, isn't just about how you view other people. It's also how you organise, whose input you value, whose context you value, and whose ideas you value. If you perceive someone as not being articulate in the correct manner, you will be more likely to ignore those ideas. If you struggle with the culturally located communication of someone, you're more likely to ignore those ideas. So when you're organising, when you're doing your political activities, you're framing it for a very specific experience and based upon your socio-economic background. I think that's relatively coherent.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So yeah, I was going to say from my perspective, I can see how like issues like space and things can be a really hard thing for people from different class backgrounds to get their head around. I remember when I was a teenager and I'd recently moved schools and I'd gone to a much more working class school than the previous school that I'd been at. And I do remember, having grown up in quite a middle class area of Newcastle, going into a friend's house for the first time from this school, and it was quite a small house, and his whole family were living in it, and his uncle and a few members of the extended family. And I do remember, I was about 15 years old, having quite a strong realization that some of the privileges in terms of just things that I would have taken for granted, like space, privacy, and sort of certain factors of life like that, were just in no way as universal as when I was a child I would have thought them to be. And I think these can be very hard things for people to get their heads around sometimes.
Yeah, for sure, absolutely. I think like some of my closest comrades for a period of time, 5-10 years ago, like all came from suburban or countryside environments where space was plentiful, both sort of, whether it be both personal and family space, and they, primarily due to the fact they came to the cities for university, and stuck around afterwards to do whatever they chose to do. I think they were still able to use primarily economic capital, but also social and cultural capital, to create spaces, to create personal spaces within a working class environment or working class neighbourhood, and quite often that came, maybe that's unfair, but I could argue that their arrival into that neighbourhood created less space for the working class community. And I'm sure we have, both of us and maybe many of the people who might listen have similar views about gentrification and the problematic aspects of it. And it isn't an individual thing, but it is a societal and political problem. But some individuals can benefit from it. So there's, my friends, my comrades were able to move into those neighbourhoods, collect cultural and social capital by being there, because gives them like a gritty street edge or whatever the fuck. An experience at the very least, and then they would leave and go to the countryside and go and live there. But the places, the houses they lived in, the rent had now been moved up to, because they wanted, so a working class family couldn't move in there. So there is no there was no benefit for those working class communities. They just see their spaces, see their home, the amount of houses they could possibly live in shrink. So what could have been 2 houses that the family could be spread out into, now they can only afford the one. And I definitely know from my own experience, like over the last decade, as I've built my own social and economic capital, how valuable fucking space is, man. Like just having a room of your own, to be able to like decompress from like the stresses and strains of living under like neoliberalism, like is hugely beneficial to my mental health. And having worked in the mental health sector for a period of time, that's a fairly common response. Like a lot of the folks I worked with, like when they were in overcrowded spaces, they were agitated. When they were in less overcrowded spaces, had personal space, they were more comfortable. I think if folk can't recognise that to a certain extent, they're going to continue to like judge economically marginalised folk a little bit harsher than they really should be.
Yeah, I think that there's a part played in this by some of the common conceptions of class that we use. So, I mean, a very sort of vulgar, simplified Marxist notion of class is sort of just to divide everything very simply into proletariat and bourgeois, like employers and employed, which is, a really, really important distinction, obviously. But I think, I wonder if you think that sometimes thinking of things only in these terms and ignoring some of the cultural and other smaller economic variations that exist within the working class and within different sections of the working class need to be analysed a lot more closely, and if you have any ideas about how to approach that.
Yeah, sure. I agree entirely. Like I don't mind. I have no problem with people just going, there's an owning class and then there's a working class, as long as there is some huge acknowledgement of the gross stratification within the working class, and how a framework of how we go about that is like vastly complicated, and like wouldn't pretend to have like the brain cells to be able to do that kind of work. Sure, someone sitting in an office somewhere might be able to, but I think if we can start to take on board like the different power relations and power coming from economic capital, social capital, cultural capital, and the different ways they play out in our everyday lives. We don't, if it's helpful to someone to like create a bunch of like groupings within or classifications within the working of the working class, fine. Like I don't really have a huge problem with that. I can't pretend or say that I'm not that interested in it. What I'm more interested in is us taking responsibility both individually and collectively for what we do with the different forms of power that we might have. I believe in the power of the working class and the working class revolution. I'm quite content with including as many people in that as possible. I don't really feel the need to bunch of fucking middle class tossers they can piss off. If they don't earn the means of production, if they aren't in managerial roles, if they don't have those two things, then cool. But they have to take responsibility for the power they have, and I guess at the moment that's mainly in my head as economic resources. Like, what do you have? What can you access? What do you have easily available to you? How can that best work for the communities of working class people that you're amongst? How can you collectivise that? How can you redistribute that? I think it's a failing of leftist thought that we haven't really pulled apart our relationship to economic growth. We still believe it's our own. I'm as guilty as anyone else. You know, I sell a book, I go, whoo, I've made this much, it's my money, yay. But I also try and think of ways in which as much of that is the income I have, the economic resource I have, is redistributed. I don't always succeed, and I'm not in a situation at the moment where I'm doing that very collectively. But I know others who are working harder at it. I think we need to think of some of those things, like unpick some of those things in our collectives and as a social movement a little harder. You know, because clearly, let's think of an example. I'm gonna pick on teachers. I do this far too often. I've probably just still got bad hang-ups from when I was at school. So clearly teachers are, I'm thinking compulsory education teachers, are hardworking, overly stretched because the education system's bag of shite. Many of them are trying to do good stuff, but because of the institution are struggling. Their classes are too big. And in many cases they come from different economic contexts to those kids. But they're also well paid off, in comparison to, say, any minimum wage worker or any 0-hour contract worker or any person who is part of the informal economy. Well, not any person who's part of the informal economy, much of the informal economy. But, you know, within the teachers' union, there is this rhetoric of, you know, working class solidarity and, fighting for everyone, we're one big union, all that crap. But there's no engagement with the resources they have. Not maybe on an individual basis, maybe some of them, yeah, sure. I've never met any of them who are doing that, but sure. But on a collective level, there is no effort but to do that, and it's the same. You know, same with doctors, same with lawyers. It's technically still part of the working class, hugely remunerated. Obviously, many lawyers and solicitors are more on the other end of the political spectrum, but not all. But there's still a thought process. It is that wealth, that income is mine. I've worked hard for it, and I would argue that. We don't work hard for our money. We sell ourselves and are paid off to keep quiet. And I think the left as a whole, both the radical parts of it and the more moderate aspects, if they're genuine about creating a socialist society, if they're genuine about creating a communist society, if they're genuine about creating an anarchist society, they need to unpack some of their immediate relations to economic resources. Otherwise, a lot of what they do is bullshit. Also, on top of that, I'd argue that those resources could be used to support the organising and work on the ground done by poor and working class organisers up and down the country, who often are doing it on top of their cleaning jobs, on top of their 0-hour contracts at JD Sports or whatever the fuck. They need economic resources, but they have no access to them because they come from poor and working class backgrounds, or poor working class backgrounds. We need to, I feel like there's a big blind spot when it comes to this stuff within the left. I'm trying to engage with some of that, but obviously I'm a gobby shite who nobody really pays much attention to.
Well, I hope people will pay more attention to you, because personally I think that the work you're doing in this direction is incredibly important, and if we want to be building inclusive larger left movements, then we really need to be appealing beyond this niche middle class sort of subsection which is most commonly represented in a lot of leftist circles. I'm interested to ask, it sounds like in one sense you're almost suggesting a sort of moves towards even an internal redistributive system within the working class, even outside of the state, which is a really, really interesting idea. Do you know of any, do you have any ideas about how this might work, or any examples of projects that you know that are going on at the moment which do this or something approaching this in a way that you think is sort of, it would be good in this way?
No concrete examples of it really, beyond the confines of I hear rumours about the occasional housing co-op or workers' co-ops in different countries, usually Germany, who are trying some form of redistribution model, or at least, there's a health surgery in Berlin, I believe, where the doctors and the cleaners get paid the same. There's a housing project, I think, also in Berlin, from the top of my head, where all money comes in, and it's I think there's about 20 of them living there. And some of them are like very well paid, some of them aren't paid at all, and they all live off the same amount of money and all have the access to this collective pot. My understanding is there's a few housing co-ops anyway in the UK that are starting to move towards some of those things. But that's obviously very small, but still, through my eyes, very positive. But absolutely, yeah, I'm a large proponent of a redistributive model outside of the state. I think we have to I have come to the conclusion, I'd encourage others to do the same, that the state is starting to tire of us. Both the state and capital is needing less and less of us to maintain itself. More and more young people are essentially disposable, and that will only increase as the generations pass. So we have to take care of ourselves and take care of each other. Primarily, for me, the most powerful way to do that is through a large-scale collectivization process. If that grew, became successful, if it became less individuals were being abandoned by the state and individuals and communities were abandoning the state, then I imagine there would be certain responses by the state and capital to it, and so we'd have to prepare for them. We'd have to it wouldn't just be like, let's create a large commune. It'd be like, we have to be prepared to defend this as we build our own economic commons or whatever. But as well as that, what I was saying in the previous point is it creates spaces. In doing that, it creates spaces for us to see, for poor and working class organisers to expand their remit, to expand their organising capabilities and capacities and ideas, moving beyond survival organising into building power within those communities and beyond those communities. But they need resources, and parts of the left have resources and they keep them to themselves. And that is, I guess, returning to the idea of what class people are, and what class composition and stratification. For me, that's class betrayal. I think I've got a piece out in Dope magazine soon where I talk about the idea of class traitors. I'm happy to accept as many people into the working class as possible, but if you're not engaging with your allocation of power, then you're betraying your class. So yes, you might be working class, but you're a fucking Judas to it. I mean, we have people in the Tory party, we have people in the Labour party who may be from poor and working class backgrounds, but they've made their way up, and then they constantly implement policy after policy which fucks over the working class. They are class traitors, but those class traitors can also be lower down the totem pole as well. Cops are obviously a big example of that. But I'd also now start to move that into those who hold on to their power, hold on to their economic resources, hold on to their social resources without wanting to further the wider movement.
So, if you were to name a few things that middle class activists could be doing at the moment to sort of open their movements and engage better with people from more marginalised and more deprived backgrounds, what would you say are sort of some of the most important starting steps for people to be doing at the moment? Because obviously it's very much just starting right now.
Sure, yeah. I guess if people are working in collectives, I guess taking inventory of the resources they have. I'd also, finding, or even, no, definitely finding rather than creating, finding spaces where poor and working class organising occurs already, and going to find out what use could us 5 people be, us 10 people, or just me as myself, what use can I be, and follow the leadership in that space. That doesn't necessarily have to mean you let go of all your hardened ideologies, which I'm as ideological as the next motherfucker, and not every piece of work and organising I've done has held on to all those ideologies because they're not necessarily appropriate in that space. I think we need to be finding different ways to support the subsistence and survival programs that already exist, and also creating spaces where we have those discussions amongst us of unpicking some of implicit bias. I've been fortunate enough to be involved in a group of people who are trying to unpick the ways in which a bunch of men who unpicking the ways in which their patriarchy has shaped them and defined them, and the ways in which they reproduce it. And I've tried to do the same on through a racialized lens. And I hear about these projects in other cities and other places with other people. I seldom hear it done around the class system. I feel like that would be valuable. I think we all have work to do on ourselves. I wouldn't necessarily go that should be a primary that should be the sole focus, because that's just talking in circles without actually putting it into practice. But yeah, finding what resources you have, finding out what resources are needing and trying to join the dots, listening hard for a prolonged period of time, proving yourself to be in it for real. It's not just a fucking holiday camp, hanging out in a poor neighbourhood and hanging out at a working class community centre just for a bit, to something cool to put on the CV, so 6 months down the line you can get a job in doing whatever, for some environmental NGO, and say, I did working class outreach. Seen that happen far too many times. Yeah, I guess those are the things.
So, how do you feel that the left in general has received your ideas when you've communicated them to you? I'd like to refer to an example here. I actually saw you speak in Edinburgh a little while ago over the summer, but I just missed you speaking at a certain environmental camp that took place quite near my city, also over the summer, and I was there before and after, but sadly was not there on the day that you actually did a workshop on class, I believe. But I did hear from some of the more working class comrades from my city, from Newcastle, who were at that workshop, that they felt there was that not everyone who was in that workshop was so willing to engage with this notion of class, and maybe were very keen to try and sort of disavow their sort of privileges. Is this something that you found to be a problem when you've been engaging with people on this topic?
Are you talking about the Reclaim the Power one or the Earth First one?
I was talking about Earth First, but trying not to name it, so I didn't say that.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean the workshop at Earth First was interesting. I don't know, it's been a mixed bag. It's always impossible to tell how connected people get to it, to the ideas. Superficial learning is, something we all do on a regular basis. I've been to, talks by black scholars where I've gone, oh yeah, and then really how much of it is really connected. I've had a lot of the yeah, and oh man, that's really important. I've not felt that much resistance, but that might also be because, say, within the book readings, particularly, it comes in a context of where I'm talking about prolonged periods of violence or marginalisation, which I specifically experienced, and people from certain class positions will always have a tendency to go have a little bit of pity, have a patronising relationship to that, so they don't want to challenge the ideas that may also be entangled with what I've been saying. So there could, people may just like, well, let him say that, but really we're not going to like pay much attention to it. I've not really had many like hard critiques in person. I've heard different rumours on the grapevine around different sections. So there is one grouping in the UK where I've definitely any discussions around class tend to like get overly theorized and turned into very abstracting and depersonalized, and it's like someone tries to go, well, I'm from a poor working class background, and they're like going, well, what does that mean, blah 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 blah, class composition, Marx, blah blah blah. So and it's like, rather than like go, okay, what is in our communities, what is happening on the ground, it's like, okay, what is happening in books written 100 years ago. We don't need to engage it on a personal level because it's written down for us. There's been a bit of that. The one you tried to avoid naming, that was a workshop. It was like, I would not do a workshop like that really again, because an hour is not enough to cover the content. It was like an hour and a half, and it was just like rushed over. So I can understand people being resistant and not completely engaging. We just like ran through some exercises, and it was like 80 people in the room or in underneath the tent. It's like, that's a fairly easy thing to like push to one side. It's sad that they do, like, but it could also just mean that they're on a different political trajectory. They have different aims and objectives to what I might have. They might simply want to like be really good at DLOCs and live in the trees, like, and that's a valid like way of life. But it's not necessarily like what I see for what I want to see in the world around me.
So one of the things that I thought was very interesting in how you approached this topic in your book was certainly that it was very clear to me as a reader that you were very keen to differentiate what you were saying here from the sort of very contemporary narrative of the white working class or something like this. And I felt that you worked very hard to you made sure that you clarified very well that there was, intersectionality at work here, and you highlighted the experiences of people of colour and trans people who you'd met in your experiences who were similarly affected by this incredibly destructive and abusive culture that we live in. I suppose I'm interested. What do you have any ideas about the white working class narrative and how it's put across?
White working class. So I think, I guess I have two trains of thought. One is that the white working class are a very easy group of people to hit with a stick over and over again by white middle class people, by the liberal intelligentsia, by the chattering cultural classes, to blame for all of the manifestations of racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, that are deep rooted within on a systemic level. It's like, it manifests themselves in there. Let's blame them for it, because fuck them. Like, most of them aren't worth shit, and that's bullshit. At the same time, though, like, white working class, poor working class organisers, and just people in general, like myself, do need to take some stock of the ways in which some of these social systems have benefited them. Not necessarily in a like, fundamentally they're still screwed by the economic system, but them buying into racist ideology, them buying into patriarchy, then buying into transphobia, is hindering their ability to resist neoliberal capitalism. Like, it is like it's setting themselves apart from folks of colour who are also working class. I've also seen, middle class folks of colour beating on white working class people because they refuse to engage with their own economic position. These things, for me, these factors are all about power and different kinds of power and how we're able to use them, or whether we can use them. I think the white working class have a specific privilege within the working class, but that is often overridden by their economic context. Some of the white kids I grew up with on the street, who were, whether they were sex workers, whether they were dealers, they had all come from chaotic homes. They had all been shat on by the system itself. Me going back in time, challenging those kids about their white privilege is a bag of shite. It's not helpful. Although it seems to be something that the Guardian want to do. They are an easy group to beat on, but at the same time, realistically, some of the more physical manifestations of the hate that is embedded within the system do come out of the white working class communities, as well as lots of other more positive things that for me they're deeply contradictory and complicated communities and shouldn't be pathologized one way or another. I feel like it's also an issue of white middle class activists find it far easier to engage with refugees and asylum seekers, migrants of different of people of colour migrants. For some reason, they find it a lot easier to frame them as the soul dispossessed, but aren't able to engage with white working class communities. Perhaps because white working class communities, have tended to leave. No, that's not true. That's not entirely true. But there's maybe a tendency of white working class communities to move to estates on the fringes of cities rather than live in the urban environments themselves. And also, one of the big targets of the radical left and the left in general are the right, and the foot soldiers of the right are white. That just tends to be the case. Not
whether they're working class or not.
Yeah, I mean, some of them for sure are, and some of them for sure aren't. And again, for me, a lot of them are simply people who betrayed the working class on a daily basis. But I think it helps middle class folk go, well, look how bad they are. Let's fuck them. They can go off because they're just the fascists. They're just the Nazis. And then those 100 people who are at a demonstration waving the St. George's flag become the symbol for all white working class people, when most of us know the reality of white working class people have been involved in anti-fascist and anti-racist stuff from the outset. And yes, there's no doubt just like middle class people do, white working class people have to unpick some of the internalized racism, internalized sexism that is throughout the system, but throughout the system. But they're not the only ones who are guilty of those behaviours and those thought processes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so one of the concepts that I think we touched on it earlier that really stands out in this book is the notion that the oppressed get to choose their own form of resistance. And I want to come back onto this a little bit more later, but I just want to ask about this in the context of what we were just saying about intersectionality, or what you were just saying about intersectionality. And I'm interested to ask, so as you also acknowledge in the book, there are occasions when engaging in very deprived communities, you do come up against people who are, not fully reconstructed intersectional anarchists on every issue of division within the working class. And I just wondered if you had any ideas about how to engage with these sorts of cultures in the working class without obviously being patronising, and also while still allowing, deprived communities and people in the working class to take the lead in their own struggles.
Sure. It really depends on the individual group or individual collectives' primary goals, primary aims. So, as someone who wants a working class revolution in which we get rid of capitalism, that's what I'm doing much of this for.
Absolutely.
Then I feel like the way the left is shaped right now is not fit for purpose for that job. I feel like it's for all of my lifetime, and I suspect the lifetime of several generations before that, it has been dominated by the ideas of specific people with specific class positions. Very seldom involving those who are the most economically marginalised. So, with that in mind, if someone takes that as the case, then I think putting the ideologies that some of us have developed over time, based on both experience and textual or video education stuff, to be able to enter into communities and put that ideology and put those ideas just to one side for a period of time. We don't have to go into them going, I'm only going to work with those of you who want to overthrow the state. I'm only going to work with those of you who are going to overthrow the capitalism. I want to go into those areas or be in those areas and go, okay, what can I do? What can we do to improve the lives, the material lives right here and now? And the idea being that will create the time and space for individuals who are already maybe politically active in their neighbourhoods or active in creating survival projects, time and space to think through their ideas, develop their own ideas without interference from those of us who have already got a position. I think it's only that when those ideas come through their own, when they're self-generated or they're generated based upon being able to reflect upon their experiences, do they have any real power? They're not everyone's going to be a intersectional anarchist, but most of the intersectional anarchists aren't intersectional anarchists. That's a goal. That's something we try and aim towards. It's not necessarily something we always are. Most of the poor and working class organisers, including the white ones who I've worked alongside or engaged with over however long, they may not have come across the term intersectional. They may not even have come across the term anarchist, but they have those ideas anyway, or they're trying to live those ideals already. They're fighting for equity. They're fighting for the survival of their communities. They're wanting to be self-managed and self-control over those communities. They just don't have. They may have different language to describe that. They identify the state being the problem. They identify capitalism being a problem, but they have to work with what they've got. Some of them may, just like myself, maybe reproduce patriarchal or racist behaviours, and most of them, hardly any that I can think of, when challenged on that, but challenged by someone who they've worked with and has shown a dedication to their work, they've responded to that. I've also seen anarchist comrades of mine go into those areas and immediately start challenging, like going, oh, I can't work with someone like this, because they were a working class white man who didn't know when to shut up, or they were a working class white woman who said those people when referring to the Pakistani community, or a Pakistani woman who refers to like the problem, the Roma problem, like, and then gone, oh, I can't work with those people. It's like, well, they're saying out loud things which you may also have internalized, except you're not self-aware enough to be able to like locate that. They are reproducing the societal discourse, but they half the time they'll also be the Pakistani woman would be completely happy like working alongside the Roma dude who lives across the street if their survival is, if it's around a thing that they both agree on, and that will unpack some of that kind of like internalized social discourse, like those problems, and same as white working class folks. It's like a lot of the time, we all ghettoise ourselves within communities who are just like us because it makes us feel safe and closeted. So white working class people living in a city probably do the same, but they're also like far more likely than the anarchist from suburbia to have engaged on a daily basis with people from all different backgrounds. They just might choose not, because they want to be with people like them. They might choose to socialise with those people all the time. Although I think that that's vastly overstated in many cases. People will always say stupid fucking shit. I will always say stupid fucking shit. The problem is to like be able to like be challenged by people who you've developed a trust and affinity with, and try and develop what your thought process and your behaviours. But not to go, I know the answers, I'm going to fucking tell you off every time you say anything because fuck you, you don't know shit, which is the left's problem.
Thank you so much for that. That's a really good response to that question. So leading on from what you were saying there, one thing I notice about this sort of, and I don't want to say just working class, because the people I'm going to talk about aren't just working class, or certainly not just the bottom of the working class, but this sort of popular notion, which a lot of working class communities do have quite strongly, of suspicion towards the government, suspicion towards elites, this sort of, like you said, people searching for these ideas. Do you think sometimes that the right understands better than the left that these ideas are present in communities? Because I see a lot of the time how effectively, I think, very much system insiders like Nigel Farage and people like that manage to sell themselves as outsiders, as campaigning against elites and so on and so forth, and against the government. And obviously, Boris Johnson at the minute is very reliant on this framing that he is against the rest of Parliament. Do you think this is something maybe that the right in this way sometimes are better at mobilising than the left?
I think what the right are better at is having a simple answer and regurgitating it ad nauseum, which will get picked up in mainstream papers and fills, the country with a specific discourse. They're good at just like going, so if Farage has identified the common man trope as his saying an anti-establishment, he will just regurgitate that with no nuance, because the media speak in sound bites, so there is no space for nuance, so that fills the arena. I'm not necessarily saying the left should do that, although like a lot of the time I don't pick up much nuance with the Momentum Corbyn stuff, and that seems to have picked up a bit of traction. I haven't really paid much attention to, or really analysed it that much, but it seems to have a certain success because it gives fairly simple answers. What are we going to do about the train service? Nationalise it. What are we going to do about do this? Nationalise it. Which is fine. I think, but I don't think that I've never been in a working class community or done any work in a poor working class community where Farage is taken particularly seriously. Like, I think it's it's not a city problem. It's a working class suburbia, working class rural problem. Therefore, my insight into it is limited. I'm still quite nervous around trees, so yeah. What maybe some parts of the left are very good at is analysing things to death, and yes, the problems are very fucking complicated. Like, you know, the way capitalism works is in its kind of biopower areas is like sophisticated. Neoliberalism is sophisticated in many ways, and so to analyse that and explain it all away like takes a specific language which can like bore people, or the way it's spoken about can exclude people. The left also want people to go, yeah, it reflects back on the previous question. They want people, politics of purity. It's like you've got to be like, have all these ideas before you do anything. So they can't, when they try and talk about their ideas, quite similar to how I've done this afternoon, they try and like talk through each aspect of it and like the different ways and that doesn't necessarily work because people don't have the fucking time. Like, you know, if you're working 60 hours a week, you don't want like some university student coming up to you and going, here are all the different things. They like have an embodied experience of all those different things. What they want is support in responding to them. They don't want like a detailed discussion about it. I think there's also like, again back to the other question, is like the assumption by the radical left is that working class communities aren't conscious of the work state and capital does on a day-to-day basis, which is beyond stupid because like a lot of the radical left moved from suburbia into university and got to 1920 before they were aware of any of it, and then the rest of us are living in council estates and council housing and in deprived neighbourhoods, living it every fucking day. Like, you know, give me an 18-year-old from NG7 in Nottingham and they will have a far better analysis of state and capital and its like behaviours than a first-year politics student at the University of Nottingham. Like, they just will, because they have lived it for like the previous 18 years. They've been working on this problem and like viewing it and analysing it just with different language and like in with a different discourse around it. Yeah, I don't have anything else to say on that.
Do you have any ideas about how we could link up these two discourses then?
How to link them up? No. I think it's more a case of like a lot of the left shutting up. It's not really about like them being linking them up. It's about like going, well, yeah, that's nice, you've studied and you've read these books and you've been developing your political theories for 10 years since you left university or whatever, but your lived experience of them are still like lacking. Essentially, if you're 30 years old and you're a leftist anarchist, an intersectional anarchist, that means the likelihood is you've only been that for 12 years. Whereas a 30-year-old from who's living in a poor working class neighbourhood the whole life, they've been working at it for 30 years. So it's just like, you might have to be able to quote people and like say this person said that or that person said that. You might have been able to sit down and think about it and like be able to articulate it more thoroughly, but it will not be embodied in your life experience. You could still learn a fucking hell of a lot, and I think maybe that should be the emphasis. It's like, okay, so what is it? What can I learn from people who this has been beaten into their bones? And their responses, and how can, again, I'm repeating the same thing, how can we support and facilitate what is already occurring, rather than how can what's already occurring feed into what we're doing?
So obviously there are a lot of systems in our society that are pretty problematic in how they relate to the working class and how they exclude people, or how they attempt to solve problems badly. In terms of trying to sort of take the boot off the neck of some of the most deprived in our society at the moment, are there any institutions that you think should be particularly targeted for reform, or for left groups to try and offer alternatives to, or anything along those lines?
I mean, so I guess you're talking about different kinds of. So it's like what can you affect? So there are state institutions which could be beneficial to people. So education, health being two, like ones that spring to mind. Like an education system of some description, although I'd far more localise it than having a national one, and health provision are two vital things for a population. But I don't see how with the current ways we're doing things, how the left is strong enough to shift that. Like, yeah, I know there's a big push to like, oh, let's get Labour in power and they'll save those things, but has that ship sailed? Like, can they save the NHS from like completely falling in on itself? I'm not sure, but it's also like not just the economic situation of those of education and the health system, but also the models of learning and the ideas around health and how we treat and engage with people who are trying to be educated and people who are have different health issues. And that's all deeply fucked. And like, I don't see how a different form of government can shift those. Maybe it can make them slightly better. That's probably a good thing. But for me, like, that wouldn't be a priority in organising around. Like, the long-term goals are for free education and free healthcare for all, but there's so much more work to be done on the ground. So I think then again about like people's everyday needs around food, for example, something we all food and water, and like we can collectively do something around those things. Like, you know, the more and more people using the food banks, but all the food banks are run by like Christian organisation, which is deeply problematic, and it's, you know, both a fucking travesty that we have them, but it's also fairly disturbing that essentially one Christian organisation has a monopoly on them, and the left have not fought to engage with that. Like, I mean, yes, there's been specific examples, like I think there's something up in the northeast that does something along those lines. I might have heard that. You probably know better than me. There was one in a food bank in Nottingham that was run by radical people of colour for a period of time, and which was like a really impressive project. And they pop up over here and there, but given the resources that, you know, let's just pick on the anarchists for now. The resources that anarchists do have, which is plentiful because they come from a whole array of class backgrounds, including fairly economically wealthy ones. Like, they have resources where we could be doing some of this, like providing free meals for school children, stuff like that, which would like relieve little bits of pressure, give a little bit more, will support families and children within our neighbourhoods, which starts to build that trust, build those relationships. But it's also, from what my understanding, it's nowhere near as exciting as rushing to the latest protest in London or whatever. It requires like a lot of hard work and a day-to-day interaction and a group of people who are committed to doing specific work, rather than those people going, I'm going to go to the protest in London, then I'm going to organise a film night in like a really obscure location, and then maybe go and see a jazz band or something. Like, it requires dedicated, prolonged work, and people aren't necessarily that keen on doing that a lot of the time. But, you know, whether it's food or, I mean, shelter as well. I know again, I've definitely heard stuff in London and up in Scotland of like organising around housing. I mean, like Acorn, for example, like.
We've got quite a big Acorn branch in Newcastle.
So I'm a member of Acorn, and I've been quite involved in the Liverpool one since I got up here. I don't agree with everything around it. Like, some of it frustrates the hell out of me. But I'd rather have a bunch of organisations that are doing some of this work in whatever way they can possibly can. Like, that's a more positive step than whatever, any other, like some of the more stereotypical things that the left tend to do. Like, they've identified a problem, they've tried to build up the power and the base to protect poor and working class housing. Yes, their infrastructure, the infrastructure has things that I disagree with, but it also has qualities to it which are missing elsewhere. And it's also done that. The fact it's not just like one branch in one city and they've built it and spread it, and yeah, fair play to them. And from what I understand, like in different cities, it has different problematic tendencies, and some it's more positive. And it's, case by case basis. But there's also the London Renters Union, who are probably slightly more to my tastes, just because of the ways in which they try and build up those relationships far more deeply before like going, this is what we're going to do. And it's like the organising is perhaps a bit more nuanced, but arguably doesn't have quite as many material successes. So it's a tricky balance. Yeah, I think groups that do that go, okay, here's a specific issue that a big portion of the working class, both like those who are most economically deprived and more of those who would be more historically secure, are facing. Like, how do we organise around that, and how do we build up relationships and build trust, and what can we do after that once we build up a little bit of power in that area, in that neighbourhood? What else can we do for these communities, with these communities? Yeah, I think things like that are fairly positive.
Yeah, and of course, if it's not completely grassroots organised or something like that, that doesn't necessarily mean it's worse than your very well grassroots organised group that actually, mostly just organises, a public meeting about Marx or about some other 100-year-old theorist once a month or something like that.
I mean, I'd argue if is organising a Marxist discussion group, it's probably not that grassroots, but yeah, I see your point. Yeah.
Well, yeah.
So, we talked a bit there about sort of positive institutional responses and how we can sort of intervene on them. How about, could you say anything about how we should relate to, or what we should do to oppose some of the negative institutional sort of responses that the state and capital give to, well, all of us, but especially to the most deprived communities, such as, the police, the prison system, social service systems and care systems and things like this?
It all goes back to the previous stuff I've said. It's like you build up the relationships, you build up the networks, and the responses to those things stem from those relationships. I previously back in Nottingham, like, it'd been all very well me having an anti-police position or having an anti-state position but me going around telling people that is fucking useless. But I build up relationships with different parts of the working class and the economically marginalised portions of that, and they then have trust that when they they have an issue, they can talk to us about it, and we can come up collectively with a response. So I'd get phone calls from police stations asking for me to come and pick up kids, because the kids knew that I could be someone who could be called upon. Parents would get us to turn up go with them to their place of employee because they were getting shit at work, and we could organise pickets and demonstrations. But it was like they only made those phone calls because they had the trust, because it'd been a prolonged period of organising, of building up like relationships. Like all the state shit onto poor and working class people like it'll happen, like it's probably happened 100, 200 times just in like a 5-mile radius of where I'm sitting now during the space of this phone call. I don't get those phone calls because I haven't been here long enough to build up those relationships. And me walking around going, I hate the police, it's not helpful. It's like you're going to build a relationship, prove that you're someone trustworthy, and then they will just have those conversations about how can we do something about this.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one way that's very common on the left of in a certain circle, in say prison abolitionist circles and things like that, of engaging with repressive power issues is the notion of transformative justice. I've been doing quite a lot of reading about this recently. I wondered if you knew very much about it or had any opinions about how effective or useful you think that is as an approach to trying to deal with security and criminal justice issues within deprived communities.
I haven't done my reading for this.
Yeah, sorry. It's not a question.
It's okay. I think I'm going to be stealing thoughts from other people to answer this, and I guess some of them I share, and some of them maybe I don't. Like as a model, I wouldn't be. I'd struggle to really like pin down lots of specifics of the model, but my understanding is it's something that is being, when it's brought into certain portions of the prison industrial complex, gets recuperated quite quickly and becomes just another part of that apparatus, and is therefore like ineffective. Done on the streets, my experience is that there's a level of transformative justice within the streets anyway. I think that it gets very so that's the best way to talk about this. Maybe half the time, my experience over the last 15 years, some act of criminality, I'm doing air quotes but you can't see it because I'm not on video, some act of criminality has occurred between one community member and another community member, and at least half the time neither one of them want the police anywhere near it. And sometimes they have the cultural resources or the social resources to bring other people into helping remedy the situation, and sometimes they don't, and sometimes they have sometimes the situation is of a severity where, so domestic violence instance, where like the community resources, because of time, finances, emotional space, aren't there to be able to engage with that situation thoroughly, and either it will carry on or someone will get a cricket bat and smack the dude over the head with it, or the police will get involved. But I don't think any of those are particularly satisfactory for anyone involved. Obviously in a domestic violence situation where it's a male perpetrator against a woman, I am not the person who should talk about what should happen in those circumstances. But in a situation, say, male on male crime, which happens a lot in poor and working class communities, like I've been in circumstances where you have to, teenagers, 17, 18-year-olds are kicking off against each other on the street, and there's nearly always some form of community response to that. And sometimes it's very like sudden, and there's a sudden burst of it. It's like, you know, whether it's separating the two, it's grabbing one of the kids and dragging him to his mum, and there's a lot. I knew a lot of people back then who would then try and follow that up. They'd be like, you know, quite often men in their 30s or 40s who had known those kids for a period of time or since they were babies, and would want to like carry on discussions of like, okay, how can we fix this fucking situation? You want to beat the shit out of him, he wants to beat the shit out of you, and maybe this third person over there wants to beat the crap out of both of you. And these dudes would like get involved and have conversations with all of them. And for me, he'd be doing a form of transformative justice. He wouldn't call it that. He'd be like, I'm taking care of my community so we don't like all kill each other. But he had those deep connections with those individuals, and was able to like have conversations with them in a way that they would be able to maintain their respect for him. So clearly, like, the prison industrial complex in all its facets should be burnt to the ground and has no place in our neighbourhoods. But we have to like be able to build something solid to replace it, because due to intergenerational trauma, we are still like reliving violence upon each other, and we have to like it will take time to unpick that and like heal ourselves as communities. What makes that work harder is when parts of the prison industrial complex, including, I hate to say it, I don't hate to say it, I'm fine with saying it, social workers, who are not from those communities, who like, you know, suburban do-gooders who went to university because they wanted to help poor children or whatever the fuck, like when they interfere, and they're overworked and overstretched, and like they can't bring all their full compassion or their full knowledge to each scenario. They just have to like, they're doing it like they would any kind of box ticking exercise. Clearly the police have no role to play in it and should fuck right off. But more and more over the next bunch of time, the police are going to be the ones relied upon to do more and more of that work. And it shouldn't be the police, it shouldn't be the social workers, it should be us, if we had the resources to carry out that work. Which again goes back to me saying like the broad left needs to be finding ways to redistribute its wealth. So some of these communities can sometimes do training, sometimes do like having the space to develop their ideas of how can we deal with these moments where our trauma is reproduced on one another. That requires a lot of work, a lot of time. I'm far more familiar with like projects in the States where they've tried to do this, but there are people all over the country who are trying to do that work, maybe not with that name, but in underfunded contexts. You know, many of the like mums I knew in NG7, they had deep passion and care for their communities. They wanted to like look after them, but they were doing like raising 3 children, working 50 hours a week, and then doing this on top of it. And then you're like, you know, someone gets pregnant or someone goes to prison, and they'd be the one supporting them on top of all the other shit they're doing. You know, there'd be a sexual assault, they'd be the one like engaging with that. There'd be domestic violence, they'd be the one engaging with that. Working class people have the answers to some of the questions around this stuff, but they have not got the time nor resources to put them all into practice, and they have not got the time or the resources to be able to share the skills they have with others in their community. That for me is part of the problem. Well, that is the problem. If we had those time and resources, we'd be able to unpick some of the that trauma that we are dealing with, and therefore, you know, far less again I'm using air quotes, criminality would occur. Also, if we had more money, we wouldn't have to rob it, people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, one more thing I wanted to draw out about the book is actually more of a sort of physical thing about the book itself. I know you self-published the book, I think, and I noticed that and I noticed when I was reading it, it was one of the most pleasant books to read that I've read from a sort of small left publisher for a long time, because it's in quite a nice size of print and with good spacing and on quite a nice quality of paper. Did you make a conscious decision to spend a little bit more on the publication to make it more accessible and comfortable to read for people who are maybe not so used as some of us to reading really squashed up text in small anarchist journals or academic books?
Pretty much. I struggle to read on the small print, so I made it bigger print. So I struggle to read when it's all crammed up, so I made it a bit more spaced out. I don't think I was really thinking about other people, just thought I might have to read this to someone one day, so I might as well make it so I can read it. The quality of the paper was completely lost on me. I just clicked certain buttons, and then I think I don't know whether you've got an active one or one of the first prints. The first print was like a random printing place on the internet that I found, and they they did a good job. It's all right. Yeah, I mean, but the first one was the same. It's like it felt the same anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's I think that was something that I noticed about it. It felt to me like sort of a bit of a following through of the philosophy of the book in its own presentation, to try and make it as accessible as possible.
Yeah, well, that's good.
Well, I think that's pretty much everything that I had lined up to ask you about. Is there anything you'd like to say before we finish? Any last messages you'd like to draw out, or anything you don't think you've been able to draw out so far that you haven't said?
No, I think I've said all I have in my head this afternoon.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd like to. Yeah, as well as the Chav Solidarity book, we've got Lumpen Journal coming out, which should have been out already, but we've had some problems with the printers. But that'll be out by the end of the month, and that's the first issue of that is a collection of writing from other poor and working class activists and organisers primarily, and then we're going to go beyond activists and organisers for future issues, where there'll be some of the editors of it are supporting people at community centres in mental health projects to do their own writing. So we're trying to pull together the different ideas and create a space for the intellectual life of poor and working class people. So that just want to publicise that as much as possible.
Yeah. And is there somewhere people can find and keep up with that and maybe donate to it as a project or anything along those lines?
Yeah, if you go to the chavsolidarity.com website, all the information's there. There's a link to help fund it, donate money and that, and then you can buy subscriptions and all that business.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for talking to me, and really, really good luck, and thank you so much for writing this book. It's been really fantastic experience all round.
Thank you very much. Cheers for reading it and that.
So, thanks for listening, everyone. I'll just do a very quick outro for this one. So, massive thanks to D Hunter for doing this interview, and thanks to Bathymetrics for the background music on the beginning and the end of this video. And as ever, I'd like to thank Blu Legender for her amazing work on the animations and graphic design for this channel. And huge thanks to all of my patrons who help make this channel possible, who are scrolling past now. And a shout out to our new patrons since the last episode: Jonathan Fairful, Flower Boy, Joan Daniels, Jigglypuffer, Alex Kostrown, Theo Lane, William Rowe, Ulrich Volker Anderson, Evil Eric, Waymore Odhi, and William Calhoun. And extra special thanks to Liam Moore. I hope I pronounced all of those okay. Please let me know if I didn't. And if you'd like to join this list and see your name in this fancy scrolling thing here, then why not sign up and be a patron yourself? That'd be really nice. And I also want to say a massive thank you to Thoughtsline for putting us in the eyeball zone the other day, which has brought loads of new people to this channel. And if you're one of the over 1,000 new subscribers to this channel who's come from that, then hi and welcome. Anyway, that's enough for this video. See you later, everyone. And don't forget to like, share and subscribe and all of that nice stuff. Bye!